Oke, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning. So I will continue our discussion about being a guide in English for guidings. Okay, so in the last meeting, we have talked about as a guide, we have to be able to direct. So we have to be able to direct by giving the correct path in directing someone, especially when our customer or our guest tries to go somewhere and they don't know where the direction. So we have to direct them to the correct places that he or she wants to go. Okay, and then the next, the guide must be able to tell the procedure. For example, in making or cooking something, what must be done when they want to do something. For example, like, okay, in a places, some tourists or maybe some guide want to, for example, like take a picture. What's the procedures? Because sometimes in a certain place there is a kind of custom, so we cannot do some kind of documentation freely. For example, like when you ever go, when you have ever been in some tourism object in Malang, there are some kind of prohibition, maybe not prohibition, but some kind of procedure that must be obeyed by the tourists. That is, first, they have to pay for each camera, and then the tourist will get a kind of tag to be tagged in their cameras, so they can use their cameras freely. And then there are certain spots, certain objects that cannot be photoed by the tourist. Okay, so you have to be able to tell the procedure to the tourist. Okay, and then next, the last is giving example. So sometimes there are a lot of tourists or maybe a lot of guys, a lot of guests that cannot understand every direction or maybe every procedure that we have told to them. So the easiest way is giving example. So we have to, what is, giving some kind of practice, giving some kind of example how to use it, where the direction, or sometimes you have to go with them to certain places just to give example to them, just to give the correct ways to do something. Okay, so that's it. There are three important points in direct someone. and then I will try to continue. So the next skills that the guide must master are describe and explain. Actually, sometimes people, what is it, try to use describe and explain. The second one is explain. When you try to explaining an object, usually explain comes after or when you try to answer the question how and why. Okay, for example, like uh, how we get there, how we get to that tourism object, and then why we are forbid, why do we forbid, why are we must, for example, why we do need this thing, for example. So you explain the answer. So describing and explaining, actually sometimes some people uh, use them use these two capabilities in the same way, but actually it differs. So you have to understand here when you try to describe an object, and then when you have to explain that object. So remember, when describing an object usually comes after what, question, and also who. For example, like who is your teacher? Okay, and then the last ability as a guide is ability to tell a story. Why to tell a story is so important? Because sometimes some tourism objects are a kind of monument that have history, a legend story, or maybe a myth. So here you have to know about the history, the legend, and the myth of a tourism object that we attend. Okay, so actually, what is the difference between history and a legend? Can you guess? Yes, history is a fact, and a legend is a kind of maybe just, yeah, we can say as a rumor or just a story made by a person that maybe happened in the past. Yeah, I say maybe. So for example, like uh, in Monas Monument Nasional in Jakarta, it has history or a legend. So most of the story are history, and also there is a legend, of course. What about myth? Yes, of course, there is always, yeah, I say, maybe not always, but often some myth in a tourism object. For example, like when you go to a beach, for example, there always be a kind of myth. For example, like when you go to uh, South Beach, South Ocean, for example, like you cannot wear a dress with uh, green color, for example. It's a kind of myth. Even when you come to some history or maybe a museum, there also a kind of myth, for example, like a ghost. Yeah, maybe you have to know about that myth in order to tell to your guests or tourists that comes with you. So you have to master and to know about it. So you have to know about the history, when that building of that tourism object, for example, myth, what kind of legend behind that monument, for example, like, and then is there any kind of myth in that places? Okay, for example, like when we go to uh, a temple, for example, like Borobudur and Prambanan temple, is there any history or maybe is there any legend? What about the myth? Is it a legend tourism object or history tourism object when we go to the temple? Most of you will say that it is a legend tourism object, but some of you may think that it is also a history one. Yes, both of you are correct because actually, when we have a building, there must be a history behind it when that building was created in the past. So it is a fact because the building exists nowadays. So it must be built in the past. And then the last, as a guide, I think you should be able to tell a joke or maybe an anecdote when your tourists or your guests feel bored, to make them, what is it? Yeah, to make them feel and feel enthusiastic, or maybe just for encourage them, or maybe just to make them happy. You can tell a joke or maybe you can tell an anecdote to them just to make them happy. Of course, the joke and the anecdote should be related with the tourism object that we attended. Okay, so that's it that I want to tell about the subject. Thank you very much for listening. Uh, I will explain and describe our practicum tasks after this.